I will not dwell upon the clemency which Napoleon wished to show towards several of the condemned men who had not blushed to associate with murderers to conspire for his destruction and for the ruin of the state, nor on the assiduity with which his family and his household interceded on their behalf. The execution of George caused little regret. Murder, no matter what its object may be, is always odious. Still, there was found someone to ask for his pardon. I saw a lady, accompanied by 2 big daughters, come to La Malmaison one day with this object. They were not received. This lady was not the most respectable agent of the Royalist party, which indeed held her in very low esteem. She belonged to a Brittany family and was the sister of a conventionel. She used to say to her husband's nephew, who was auditor of the Council of State, that if he accepted the Cross of the Legion of Honor, she would never receive him again at her house. The prosecution of the accused and the investigation of the charges against them was proceeded with by the French government in the full light of day. Not one circumstance, not one detail of the various phases of the conspiracy, not one loophole opened to Moreau or Pichegru in remembrance of services which they had formerly rendered was passed over in silence. Nothing was left for the secret historian to glean. Everything bearing upon this vast conspiracy had been published in the Moniteur and 100 other publications. The murders of Pichegru and of the English Captain Wright, said to have been strangled in prison, are calumnies which are refuted by their very absurdity. It seems to me unnecessary to add a single word to the denials with which this wretched and odious imputation has been met. Moreau, after his condemnation, asked and obtained permission to retire to the United States. Napoleon canceled the sentence of 2 years' imprisonment to which the general had been condemned and made no objection to his departure for the United States. It was rumored that the judges had been secretly pressed to pronounce sentence of death on Moreau so that Napoleon might have the opportunity of crushing his rival under the weight of his clemency. Napoleon was much too clever to take a false step with people whom he knew to be opposed to him. What has not been said besides? Certain historians have reproduced all these romances with the remarks that there was nothing improbable about these stories. If suppositions were admitted as facts, because they appear probable, might it not be said that Moreau's judges were influenced by his fame or by the large number of his partisans? For, after all, his guilt was proved, and his name had an immense weight in the conspiracy. Napoleon must have been dissatisfied with the judgment pronounced because he believed, and probably wrongly, that considerations unfavorable to himself had influenced the members of the tribunal and distorted justice. The resentment was not, however, of long duration. Napoleon had had an idea which was worthy of him. He had had it suggested to Moreau that he should ask him for a private interview. Had the person who was charged with this mission acted with more skill, it is probable that Moreau, in the state of mind in which he was, would have received these overtures favorably. Such a scene would probably have produced the most favorable impression about the new Augustus in the public mind. Napoleon purchased with the police funds the estates of Grosbois in the house of the Rue d'Anjou, which had formerly belonged to Moreau. He gave Grosbois to Marshal Berthier, and the house in Paris to Marshal Bernadotte, whose gratitude for this new favor was as scanty as it had been for previous favors. It was whilst the George trial was in progress before the said court of the Assizes that Napoleon remembered Bourrienne. "Do you know," he asked me, "whether Bourrienne is in Paris?" "You must find out and write to him to go to the trial. Every evening he must send you a report of what he has heard. He is a very good man for that sort of thing." Bourrienne's reports were regularly sent in to me and transmitted by me to Napoleon. This led to Bourrienne's appointment as plenipotentiary minister to Hamburg about a year later. Napoleon's return to him is a fresh proof of his remembrance of the services which he had rendered, and of the generosity with which Napoleon forgot the wrong done him. Although the conduct of this old schoolfellow was far from being irreproachable at Hamburg, he tolerated him there. During one of our campaigns in Germany, the necessity of being informed of what was going on before and behind our armies made Napoleon desire to receive weekly reports from his ambassadors at Hamburg and Munich. The Cross of the Legion of Honor was frequently asked for by Monsieur de Bourrienne in the letters which accompanied his reports. I was ordered not to answer these requests, as they were frequently repeated. I obtained this answer from the emperor. Write to him, as he worships the golden calf, he shall have money, but that, as to the Legion of Honor, I only give it to those who... The empire had emerged from these storms. All the combinations of corruption, conspiracy, and murder had ended only in the elevation of the man whose destruction had been compassed by these infamous means. Like Hercules, he strangled the serpents in his cradle. It was the prestige of a greatness which will be the subject of eternal conversation of the world. The forms of the new court were copied from those of the ancient French monarchy and the imperial monarchy of Germany, purged of what was servile and Gothic. There were grand charges of the empire and grand charges of the court. Napoleon wished to associate his colleagues with his elevation, and one was promoted to the dignity of Arch-Chancellor, and the other to that of Arch-Treasurer of the Empire. The two brothers of the Emperor, Joseph and Louis, were created the first Grand Elector and the second Constable. Napoleon created 20 posts of Marshal for his comrades at arms, of which 4 were bestowed in reward for former services on Generals Kellerman, Lefebvre, Perignon, and Serrurier. 14 places were given to generals on active service, distinguished by the occupation of important commands and likely to be called to render fresh services. These were Generals Berthier, Murat, Montcy, Jourdan, Massena, Augereau, Bernadotte, Soult, Brune, Lannes, Mortier, Ney, Davout, and Bessières. The other 2 places were held in reserve. The emperor had his chamberlains, écuries, etc. The empress on her side had her ladies-in-waiting. The prefects of the palace were retained. The chamberlains and the ladies-in-waiting belonged to old families who desired places at the imperial court, with the exception of some who remained faithful to their royalist opinions, or who made it a point of honor to figure in the opposition. A new ceremonial was established in the services of the court and was laid down in a code. The sovereign's person was no longer accessible to the same persons as before. Officers who till then had enjoyed the privilege of approaching the head of the state and of presenting themselves whenever they pleased had to yield up this privilege to the chamberlains and the newcomers, who formerly had been obliged to have recourse to the military element. The introduction of this etiquette offended the greater number of these officers. They submitted to it with disgust and grumbling. Little by little, the custom of these changes established itself. Nevertheless, although the army's zeal did not diminish, there remained in the hearts of the soldiers a keen regret for having been deprived of a right by usurpers, whom they never regarded with favor. The object in bringing to the imperial court persons belonging to families which had formerly been attached to the court was to approach these families to the sovereign's eyes, to interest them in the new order of things, to remove them from the intrigues of the malcontents, to withdraw them from all harmful influences, and to bring about a fusion of the various classes of society. At the same time, these new servants, more familiar with the usages of polite society, were better fitted for being placed in contact with strangers. However much Napoleon may have been perplexed by the redoubtable crisis through which he had just passed, and in spite of the diversion brought about by his accession to the imperial throne, and by the organization of his court and the imperial state, his attention had never been turned away from the serious war which he was forced to carry on against England. He pushed forward with the same activity, administrative measures, diplomatic negotiations, and military preparations. He had ordered that several camps should be formed, amongst others one at Compiègne, this camp being near to Paris, and within easy reach. The first consul, who had become emperor, went to spend some days at the castle of Compiègne to inspect the camp, which is chiefly composed of dragoon regiments. It was under the command of General Bérégoet d'Illiers, in his capacity of inspector general of troops of this class. At his orders, the dragoons went through various exercises before the emperor's eyes, both on foot and on horse, to show their qualities both as horse and as foot soldiers. The result of these maneuvers was not satisfactory, and the plan was abandoned. Amongst the authorities of the department who came to Compiègne to present their respects to the new sovereign was Monsieur Octave de Ségur, sub-prefect of Soissons. He was the eldest son of the Comte de Ségur, who had been appointed Councillor of State by Napoleon, and who was afterwards made Grand Master of Ceremonies. This young man, who gave the highest promise and in whose family Napoleon took a special interest, disappeared without leaving any clue that could be led to his discovery. After his return to Soissons, when the camp had been broken up, it was not known for many years what had become of him. Domestic worries, exaggerated by a morbid imagination, had disgusted him both with his home and with society. It was only after the war in 1809 that Octave de Ségur was heard of. He had enlisted under an assumed name in the 6th Regiment of Chasseurs, commanded by Colonel Valin, and had carefully kept his secret for 6 years. Taken prisoner and being invalided, he had been sent to Hungary, where he was living on the estate of the exiled Comte Bashi Ducala, father-in-law of the Countess Ducala. The worries of his life as an outlaw and the privations which he had to undergo induced him to write to his brother to inform his family of his whereabouts and to obtain his return to France by means of an exchange. Napoleon had sincerely sympathized with the Comte deSégur's troubles and had written him a touching letter at the time of his son's disappearance. He had never ceased to be interested in the mystery which had enveloped his flight. At last, one day, when at Pont-de-Brique, a country house near Bologna, where his headquarters were established, he heard that Octave de Ségur was on board one of the ships of the Texel fleet under disguise. Napoleon immediately sent for his brother Philippe, who was in service in the palace as captain deputy to the Grand Marshal of the palace, informed him of what he had learned, and gave him a plausible mission by the help of which he would be able to discover his brother. Philip de Ségur returned from his mission without being able to find any traces of the fugitive, who had either been clever enough to avoid discovery or who possibly, contrary to what had been reported to Napoleon, had never been on the ship at all. When Octave returned to France, he had lost precious years for his advancement in the service. The emperor having asked him if he had the intention of pursuing his career, he answered that he preferred to remain a soldier. Touched by these chivalrous sentiments, but regretting the choice he had made of a career which should only be entered upon by a young man, Napoleon appointed him officer on the ground of his having been a scholar at the Polytechnic School. His second debut in war was unfortunate. Made a prisoner at Vilna at the beginning of the 1812 campaign, he did not return to France until after the fall of the empire. He then entered the king's military household. A victim to extreme melancholy, he was not able to drive away the somber fantasies which pursued him and which finally drove him to suicide. This unhappy man had turned over his fatal design in his mind long before his death. He used to live in the same rooms as his brother Philippe. His son Raymond, who slept in a closet next to his bedroom, heard his father repeatedly getting up in the night and walking about the room, wrapped in thought, which was expressed by vague exclamations, the sense of which Raymond was unable to understand. At last, one evening, Octave went to the house of a friend who owed him some money. Finding him out, he tore up the promissory note which his friend had signed in his favor and threw the scraps of paper before the door. He then went to the St. Michael Bridge, carefully filled his pockets with stones, and lying down in the bed of the river, then at low water, crossed his arms with an inflexible resolution and awaited death. At daybreak on the morrow, he was found in this attitude, and nothing was done that could call him back to life. Since I have had the occasion to speak of this member of the de Ségur family, I will add some details about them. I spent 2 years as a child at Châtenay, a pretty village in the neighborhood of Paris. The Comte de Ségur was living there with his wife, his children, and his aged father, Marshal de Ségur, in a state bordering on destitution. Count and Countess de Ségur's fortune had been exhausted in costly embassies and the loss of the colony of San Domingo, where they had important properties, had consummated their ruin. Monsieur de Ségur, whose philosophy sustained him against adversity, was living by his pen. He used to write serious books, light comedies, and songs. He composed speeches for the deputies, the Conseil des Anciens, and the Conseil des 500, the Council of 500. Amongst others, for Baudin and des Ardennes. I was present at the marriage of his eldest son, Octave, with his cousin Germaine, Mademoiselle d'Aguesseau. This union, formed under favorable auspices, was not to be a happy one. The castle of Fresnes, which belonged to the d'Aguesseau family, was close to Châtenay. I can still remember a strange rumor which greatly exercised the peasants in the neighborhood. It was said that a bull from the Fresnes farm, each time that it was driven out, used to run away from the herd and force its way to the cemetery, where it would dash upon the tomb of an ardent revolutionary who was buried there and rip up the sods in his grave with its horns, a proceeding which was generally considered a token of divine vengeance. Napoleon, on his accession to power, called to his side all men of capacity, irrespective of their origins and of their previous performances and opinions. Monsieur de Ségur's merits could not escape his attention after the 18th Brumaire, the former ambassador of France to St. Petersburg, and Berlin became a member of the legislative body. He was placed a year later in the Council of State, where he rendered useful services. At the time of the foundation of the empire, he was appointed to one of the great charges of the crown, namely that of master of ceremonies. Napoleon took this family under his protection and lavished his inexhaustible kindness upon them. The Comte de Ségur's father, former Minister of War and Marshal of France, had lost his pension. Napoleon restored it to him, and when the old mutilated officer came to the Tuileries to thank him, he had the honors paid to him, which were formerly attached to his rank. The Comte de Ségur's oldest son, who was thought to have a vocation for the civil service, was appointed, as the readers will remember, sub-prefect at Soissons. The second son was destined for a military career. He was placed first of all with the so-called Bonaparte Hussars, a troop which had been formed as part of the reserve army, which was then being assembled at Dijon. In order to have them near his person, Napoleon afterwards appointed him adjutant of the palace, then quartermaster, and then master of the pages. He married him to Mademoiselle de Lucé, daughter of one of the prefects of the palace, and endowed him with an income of 10,000 francs charged on the state, and with valuable estates abroad. In 1813, he entrusted him with the command of one of the 6 regiments of his Guard of Honor. Countess de Ségur, great-granddaughter of the celebrated Chancellor d'Aguesseau, who was distinguished by the loftiness of her character and by most amiable qualities, was nominated vice president of the Maternity Society, of which later on the Empress Marie-Louise became president. The fall of the empire did not deprive the Comte de Ségur of all the advantages which he owed to the emperor's generous patronage. He found himself at the time, it is true, at Blois, in the suite of the Empress Marie-Louise, with 300 louis as the whole of his possessions, but sometime later he re-entered the Chamber of Peers as a former senator and recovered the pension which had been allotted to him in this capacity. In 1815, he once more fulfilled the functions of Grand Master of Ceremonies during the 100 Days. It must be said, to Comte de Ségur's honor, that he often used to express his gratitude for the acts of kindness with which the emperor had loaded his family, and that he religiously respected his memory until the end of his life.